My name is John Whinery. I am originally from Muncie, and I went to undergrad at the College of Worcester. 1 year at Northwestern, didn't like it, then switched to the College of Worcester, a small Presbyterian college in Ohio, and then I went to the University of Michigan for law school. When I attended Michigan Law School, I think it had about 1,000 in the law school, and there were 300 and some in my class. I went to Michigan because I applied to various schools I thought were really good law schools, and the Michigan was the one I got in. So it was just about that simple. And it was an interesting time. Things were changing in law schools in the 60s. When I was in law school, which was from 1963 to 1966, there were amazingly few women in my law school class. I can't tell you exactly how many, but I would say it was about 5%, something like that. And then about 1970 or the early 1970s, I remember reading something from Michigan, and the women were about 40%. So in a very short space of time, you went from something like 5% to something like 40%, and that had to be in about 7 years. So the 60s were a dramatic time of change, and that was the time that the women really started going into law in large numbers, and it's amazing it happened in such a short period of time. And you would have thought that Michigan, a school like Michigan, had been a little more on the front edge of things, and yet in 1963 it was about 5% women in my class. I graduated in 1966. Going to law school, I was undecided why did I go to law school. I was a history major, and of course if you're a history major you got to figure out what are you really going to do in life. And of course I thought about teaching history in college, but that was a very tight job market, and it would have been very tough. And so I took the law board just to see, well, do I have an aptitude for law? Also, I saw To Kill a Mockingbird. I think an awful lot of people went into law because of To Kill a Mockingbird. And so it was very appealing, the story of Atticus Finch and the sort of person he was, and the idealism that he represented. So the combination of things, I did pretty well on the law boards, and I was influenced by To Kill a Mockingbird, and thought about being a minister, thought about being a journalist, but anyway, I drifted into law. So I went to Michigan Law School. I was fortunate that the law school had just changed about the time I got there. They were telling horror stories of just a couple years earlier when they would have a very high flunk rate. They would have exams that were 100% of your grade. You'd go through the whole semester, and then you'd have an exam that was 100% of your grade. And people were, fainting in the bathroom the night before, and you heard all these horror stories. But fortunately, right before I got there, they switched to the philosophy that if you're good enough to get in, you're good enough to stay in, and they stopped that high flunk rate. And we still had in most of our classes, we still had exams that were 100% of the grade. But that changed a little bit during the time. In some classes, it wasn't that way. But still, that final exam was very, very important. And in those days, I think Michigan had a very good reputation, but I doubt that it was any better than IU's law school. What you found was that some of the teachers who had the big reputations for their writings were not that good a teacher, weren't that good at teachers, and then some of the teachers who were not so well known outside the law school were wonderful teachers. So I began to be a little dubious of reputations. Of course, what you want is really good teachers. But anyway, Michigan was a pretty good law school. I doubt that was any better than IU Law School. Then the question is, where do you practice? And you've got to choose your state and take bar exams in those states. I didn't have any spatial ties to Michigan, and I thought, well, I'll come back to Indiana. And again, influenced by To Kill a Mockingbird, I decided I wanted to be a small-town lawyer. Huge mistake. I went to Franklin, Indiana, And I was with went to a two-man firm, Pogue and Young. When I got there, I found out that one of the gentlemen was deep into alcohol, and the other person was deep into politics. And I was virtually not trained in Franklin, and I found that if you're not from a small town, it's not really smart to move to a small town. And I was single, and it just was a pretty bad experience. So then I went to Michigan, started over. Well, see what job openings they have in Indiana, and there was an opening in Evansville, and I'd never been to Evansville. And so I came down and had an interview with Fine, Hatfield, Sperrenberger, and Fine. And they offered me a job, and I took it. It actually was for less money than I was making in Franklin. It was, I think it might be helpful for me to talk about Fine, Hatfield, Sperrenberger, and Fine. And it's interesting because I think that law firm was a pretty good example of maybe what was happening to the legal profession about that time. I came in to be hired to work with Gene Fine, who happened to be on vacation that week. His father ran the firm. Isidore Fine ran the firm almost completely. And that was evidenced by the fact that here Isidore was interviewing me to work with Gene, who was on vacation. And Isidore was the one who hired me without, I guess, any input from Gene. So, so when Gene came back from vacation, I presume Isidore told him that I'd been hired. Isidore was quite an interesting fellow. His family owned the theaters, I think 3 of the theaters, wasn't it 3? And so he was part businessman, and you come out of law school all theory, and Isidore was all practicality. So actually, I thought I really worked with Isidore and Gene, more with Gene than Isidore, but some with Isidore. And but it was good because the Fines were such practical people. They were part businessmen, part lawyer, and I thought, looking back, it was good that I did work with them because they gave me that practical balance that I needed coming out of law school. Isidore was an old school Jewish gentleman, and he was family values before family values. You'd ever heard of family values. And my interview was sort of interesting because my mother there was a man in Evansville, Glenn Ogle, who was raised by my great-grandparents. His parents died young. My great-grandparents raised him. He moved to Evansville, was in the milk industry here, and I think with Ideal Dairy, and had done quite well. And anyway, my mother knew Glenn well, and she wanted to come down and visit Glenn and Miriam the same time I was coming down for my interview. Well, I wasn't too anxious to tell Isidore that I'd come down to Evansville with my mother, but Isidore's style of interviewing was the main thing he was interested in was your family. What sort of family are you from? And so he very quickly found out that I'd come down with my mother, and then he said, well, who did she come to visit? He was very interested in who she came to visit in Evansville. Well, he knew the Ogles, thought highly of the Ogles, so that was a big plus with Isidore. And so the interview just sort of turned around on a dime when I said the Ogles. And then he wanted to meet my mother. So, I mean, this is something that would never happen today. But that was Isidore. So it got down not so much to me, but to the Ogles and my mother. Nice. And so it was a different time, but he was more interested in what sort of person are you, what's your family like, where do you come from, so Isidore hired me, but only offered. I still remember that salary offer. I wanted to come with Fine Hatfield, but I was stunned when he offered only $6,600. I was making $8,000 in Franklin, $8,000 a year, and of course those are different times. And actually, $6,600 is a lot better than it is today. But I don't know what the equivalent would be. It'd probably be, I don't know, high 20,000s or something like that, maybe. But it's still low by any standard. So I didn't immediately accept when he made the offer. I was so stunned by the low offer, and then I think he called back and sweetened the offer by saying after 6 months he'd raise it to $6,900. So and my parents said, well, you know, if you do a good job and they like you, in the long run, it'll work out. But Isidore was very, very conservative on his salary views. And they were 6 attorneys, Fine, Hatfield, Sperrenberger, and Vine, plus Jim Marchand, who did real estate, plus Don Wright, who was trial attorney. And then they hired 3 of us all at once, Joe Anakin and Tom Terrell and me. We all came out about the same time. Tom Terrell was supposed to work more with Isidore, and then Joe worked in the trial department with Joe Hatfield and Don Wright. And the 3 of us got along real well. But Joe, I was single, and Joe Anakin and Tom Terrell were married with children. And I don't know what they were getting exactly. I think it was more than I was getting, because Isidore certainly would calculate how much does this person need. But so I think they were getting a little bit more than I was, but probably not much. And there's no way they could make it with a wife and children on whatever Isidore was paying them. That probably wasn't too much higher than what I was getting. But anyway, it was a situation where, yeah, I could actually live within the 6,600 and I think even save a little something. But I lived in some pretty modest apartments. But Tom and Joe left after about a year. We would have lunches together where we would just talk about salary, and I remember us talking that well, maybe we should get a part-time job at a McDonald's or Dairy Queen. If Isidore walked in and saw us working part-time at McDonald's or Dairy Queen, maybe that would make the point. But we talked about things like that. But it's just a different age. Isidore was from a different age. He was quite an interesting fellow, and again, I think I remember Isidore fondly for all his financial conservatism. He, like I said, was a very practical person. I remember him talking about a client. Isidore sort of had the reputation of being a very wise man who sort of had, you thought he had some sort of spatial connections with politics, and I don't think he did really, but with some people he had that reputation. He certainly, there was certainly a large amount of practical wisdom that Isidore had, and he was a good businessman. They'd been successful with the theaters. He also started Channel 14. Fines originally owned Channel 14. And the NBC station, and so he was a good businessman, and that's partly why he was, I think, widely respected. But an example of Isidore's practicality is one man came in with a wad of parking tickets, a real good client, and said, "Isidore, take care of these." In those days, it was widely rumored that parking tickets could be taken care of if you knew the right people. And our client thought that Isidore knew the right people. And Isidore said, the man said, "Take care of him." And said, "Yeah, I took care of him. I went over and I paid him." And he said, "If I do have any political influence, I'm certainly not going to waste it on parking tickets." But that was Isidore. And he was sort of like a grandfather figure to people. And even if the clients were in their 50s, he would be talking to them like they were his grandchild. And some clients really liked it because, like having that trusted, wise grandfather figure advising you on your business and your legal matters. And then so there were some clients who didn't like. If you're 57 years old, you're not looking for a grandfather maybe. So it didn't always go over well, but some people really liked it because one of the nice things about Isidore was he was concerned not just with solving their legal problems, but in seeing them succeed. And I think maybe we've lost some of that. I mean, even in our office, people come in with a specific problem or a specific task, and you work with them on whatever it is, and then you switch to the next client. Where Isidore is more like he'd take on a client for life, and he really wanted them to succeed. And I can think of some particular business people who, even though they were, pretty well up in years, they looked on Isidore as sort of the wise sage to guide them. And he would say things like, he thought that it was unwise for a business person to put all their money into their business. And so one of his favorite sayings was, many a business has been saved by what Mama kept in the cookie jar, which meant don't put all your assets in your business. Always have some aside. Get to the point where you could walk away from your business.
Let me ask you one question, just for historical purposes. His son was Gene.
Yeah.
Was his grandson Mark?
Yes.
So there's 3 generations.
3 generations.
Now.
Right.
Mark was with Rudolph Fine, Porter, and Johnson.
Yeah. He was with Fine Hatfield for a while.
For a while. Okay.
But then broke away. And Isidore would have these humorous stories, and the longest humorous stories you've ever heard. So he was in his mid-70s. I mean, well, he was basically in his 70s when I was there. And he would come in, and if somebody had heard a good story, they'd tell it to Isidore, and then he would spread it around. And he would come into your office and sit down and sort of have a certain look. Oh, he's going to tell me a story. And some of them were good, and some of them were not good. And I was a young, insecure associate, and so you thought, well, I need to laugh whether I think it's funny or not. And again, you never knew it was going to be a good story or a not so good story. And he got to the point where he had trouble remembering names. He'd get in the middle of the story and he'd start talking about whatchamacallit, and so you'd have trouble following the story of Isidore. And then he'd sort of pause in the middle of the story. They go on for like 3 or 4 minutes before you get to the punchline, some of them. And you'd have to sort of stay alert to be around for the punchline. And but anyway, he had this folksy manner, and he was the Fines were warm, friendly people. And but anyway, Isidore really ran the show. It was Fine, Hatfield, Sperrenberger, and Fine, but the management was all Isidore Fine while he was living. He had been, they told me there'd been something of a bulldog during his early years, and I was seeing the more mellow Isidore Fine, that he'd been sort of the tough, aggressive, no-nonsense businessman. And he once had a conference with an IRS man, I think, on an estate tax return. And I may have to clean this up a little bit. But anyway, this showed a little bit of the old Isidore, and the question was, how do you value certain assets on this federal estate tax return? And some of those IRS agents in those days could be pretty tough customers, and Isidore started the conference by saying, "I'm going to start this conference on the assumption that you're a chiseling SOB, and you have to prove it to the contrary." And so that was the old Isidore, the not so mellow Isidore. And but anyway, that's the person he was. He was a good, successful, no-nonsense businessman. He mellowed some by the time I'd gotten there, but he's also a warm person, a wise person, a practical person, and so I think back on him fondly, even though he sure was conservative on financial matters. He, at one point, some parts of the Isidore story are funny. At one time he decided that, well, he needed to start training Tom Terrell and Joe Anakin and I in management, and what it's like to sit under partnership meeting and what you have to decide, and here's how you do it, and here how things go. So he decided, he's going to take us into the shallow end of management and start training us. And so Isidore called the 3 of us in the conference room, explained, sometime eventually we'd be in partnership meetings, and he was going to start training us for that. And his example of what to have us discuss was, he pointed out a wastebasket in the corner and says, "What do you think of that wastebasket?" And so all 3 of us were just sort of flabbergasted. How do you discuss a wastebasket? but he didn't want to get us into deep management issues. So his topic was that wastebasket in the corner. What do you think of it? And he's a very conservative, so a very conservative fellow when it came to management or finances, but a very warm person overall. And I was single, so I could stand the financial difficulties. But if you're married, you couldn't live on the salary that Isidore wanted to pay you. And so he did lose two good attorneys, Tom Terrell and Joe Anakin. And the other attorneys, I doubt that they had felt the freedom that they could go into Isidore and say, Isidore, you need to pay these people more. I think at some point Gene Fine went in and made that point, but initially I think they let Isidore call the shots on how much associates were paid. So that's situation on Isidore. Gene was somewhat like his father, a very practical person, part businessman, part lawyer. He also had that same approach to clients that Isidore did, that you weren't just a client for a day or a week. If you're a client, you were really a client, and the Fines really wanted to see you succeed. Anybody who came in with a corporation, or the clients wanted to do everything they could to help them and give them practical advice, business advice, financial advice, as well as help them with their legal problems. And so Gene established very warm connections to his clients, and he had lunches, a lot of lunches. He was sort of the master of the lunch. He'd have lunch with his good business clients. His good business clients were also his friends. So I mean, he was not just a lawyer. He was a personal friend of his good clients, and he would have lunches with them. And he was in a stock club. So here I was in my 20s, and I was put in the stock club with these people in their 50s and 60s and 70s who had all this business experience, and here I was with really no knowledge of the stock market. But it was good for me because I would hear these businessmen talk, got to know them. Again, the Fines were, I think, very helpful in developing me. I did feel sort of insecure and uncertain of myself when I came to Evansville. And the Fines sort of brought me along. They were friendly and warm and worked me into their relationships with their clients. So I look fondly back on my time with the Fines. Gene would have me out to his house, and little Mark was there, and little Diane, and so I knew them from a very young age, and Bobby, and they were always very warm and friendly. So it was good to be with the Fines. Charlie Sparrenberger was mostly real estate, did a lot of work for Meade Johnson. Charlie, did you know Charlie?
No.
He would come across to you as just a splendid gentleman. I mean, people who would meet Charlie and talk with him. He was a good conversationalist, animated, had good stories, and anybody meeting Charlie would think, gee, what a fine gentleman. And he was a good attorney. He was mostly real estate, though he did other things as well, but mostly real estate. And had a real good tie to Meade Johnson. Did a lot of work with John Breckenridge of Meade Johnson. He was the attorney for Meade Johnson. And when a Meade Johnson executive would come to town, Meade Johnson would, when they would get when they got transferred, Meade Johnson had a program where they would buy the house back from the executive at a certain value, where the executive who was being transferred would not take a financial beating by being forced to sell their house suddenly. And those matters would come through Charlie. So a lot of Meade Johnson work. But Charlie, as I talked to Charlie over the years, he had come up in the practice of law when things were pretty tough financially. I think we've lost track of how tough it was financially for lawyers in those days. In the early days, the first few years, lawyers didn't make any decent money. I remember Charlie liked to tell the story of, and this, I don't know, back in the 30s or something, of a lawyer came in and had an initial conference on employment with a firm, and and they talked about money and so on, back and forth, and they settled on a figure. But it was the young attorney paying the firm. It was it was not the other way. And Charlie talked to, he started with Walker and Walker. So many attorneys in those days started with Walker and Walker. That was almost like the gateway to the legal profession, I think, in Evansville. And he would talk about Walker and Walker a lot. And one time they were moving their offices. I remember Charlie talking about the story where there was a vase. They were cleaning out an office and they're going to move to another place. And there was this vase up high on a shelf in a closet. And somebody looks up and says, "Oh, you know, that's old so-and-so." And it was some lawyer's ashes in Walker and Walker office up on a shelf. And so anyway, he would have stories like that. And so Charlie was an entertaining person to have lunch with. But he was somewhat, there was a side to Charlie that was a little bit, I guess you could say bitter, in that he started the practice of law when it was pretty tough. Another thing he was sort of disappointed with was he went into the Navy in World War II, and the lawyers who didn't have to, who had some sort of physical problem and didn't have to go into World War II, really lost their position. I mean, the ones who went to war in World War II and came back had really suffered economically, while the ones who could stay here and build their practice were in much better position. So Charlie had, some lasting, lingering resentments, and as a result, he thought young lawyers should still be treated very conservatively financially. So he was pretty much the same mindset Isidore was on compensation of younger attorneys. And Fine Hatfield did not have a retirement plan. Boy, that's one thing I wish I could go back and change. It would have been great to have a retirement plan from my early years. And so my criticism of Fine Hatfield, the old Fine Hatfield, was that they were too conservative financially, particularly in the treatment of associates. But they were good persons to work with personally. They had, I would say, high ethical standards. They really were concerned about their clients. Looking back, I'd say they were pretty conservative billers, certainly set against today's standards. And so in those days, if you were a lawyer, and this would be in the 60s, early 70s, I would say you'd have a good position in the community. You'd be generally well respected, but you weren't making, except maybe for a few exceptions, you weren't making a huge amount of money. I mean, you were doing better than average, but even the people at Fine Hatfield, I don't think they were doing okay. They were doing better than average, but they weren't making real high levels of compensation, I think. And it was a different age. I think a factor, particularly on real estate, was the Bamberger firm. Bamberger firm and Oswald and Hahn were very conservative billers on real estate, and so I remember a title opinion was like I think $30, and nobody could go above $30 for a title opinion because Bamberger is going to hold it at $30, and if you went to 35, then the financial institutions would go over to Bamberger. So, and I remember talking to my brother-in-law in Atlanta about real estate closings and what lawyers made down in Atlanta on real estate closings. And here, real estate was almost like a lost leader. In Atlanta, it was great big, that was the place to be in real estate law, whereas in Evansville, you were sort of in the depressed area of the law if you were in real estate, and in Atlanta, that was where the big money was. So it was a different age, and the Bamberger firm really held down fees. I'm not saying that bitterly, but I'm just saying that was the fact. Legal economics were very different in the 60s and early 70s.
Do you think advertising changed that, John?
I think it changed. I was thinking about that as I prepared for this. I think it was a dramatic change.
Okay.
And that was about in the late 70s. It was at the bar, B-A-R-R. Was that? Am I saying that right? The bar. I may not be quite saying the name of the case, but it was. I know it was about 1976 or so. I think the that basically you could not restrict legal advertising because it was a First Amendment issue, freedom of speech. Lawyers had a right to say, to advertise.
Yes.
And I think the profession changed dramatically. I don't want to say everything hinged on that, but I think it was a huge change in the legal profession. Gary Gerling was very quick to react to that, and he was ahead of the curve, very quick to act, very quick to see what the opportunities were, went into it aggressively and effectively. And but I think that was part of a big change in the practice of law. Sometime during my time there, I was with Fine Hatfield from '67 to '82, about 15 years. And I saw the profession change. And with the fines, you know, was that, you know, good old ethic that you tried very, very hard to help your clients succeed. You wanted, you know, better than an average living, but you didn't make really big money. At least I didn't. I don't think even the partners were making that good an income. I mean, respectable, better than average, but nothing great. And but then I think somewhere in the '70s, things did begin to change, and I think the sort of the money machine approach at law firms began to come in. I just, somewhere in the '70s, the approach to the practice of law began to change. It became more of a business, you know. I think the larger law firms would require so many billable hours from associates, and then they try to, whatever was written down. I don't want to be too unfair to larger law firms, but whatever they would write down, the law firms would try to bill, and they would not evaluate, well, was the young lawyer efficient in spending 8 hours on this matter or not. It's more like, oh, 8 hours, we're going to bill it. And so many billable hours required of associates each year. Now, Fine Hatfield never went to that when I was there, but I think over the profession overall, you could see it in that direction, and you could see it some in Fine Hatfield, more pressure to get more fees, and I don't want to make this Fine Hatfield because I think it's a across-the-board comment that in the practice of law, I think money became to be a bigger issue, and somehow the practice of law changed, and I don't know how to say it any better than that. But and I'm not saying that lawyers didn't still try to do a good job for their clients, but I think while I was at Fine Hatfield, the legal profession changed, and I got out of high school in 1959, and as I look back on my life, I think the people who graduated from high school in '59 were like the youngest of the old generation. I'm still comfortable with people older than myself. I remember being in college, and I was, I think, about maybe 27, and I had a date with a girl who was maybe 22, about 5 years difference, and it was shocking, the difference between us. I was very taken by this girl, but as we went on a date, and then we went out to eat afterwards, and I mean after seeing a show, and as we talked, it developed that she thought I was strange because I wasn't into drugs. I thought she was sort of strange because she was into drugs. And it just, the cultural, we were only about 5 years difference, and the cultural difference between us was just so great. And I still liked her, and we got along okay, but obviously there was just too big of a cultural divide. So, you know, the '60s really were a time of change. So I think I started in under the tutelage of the old school people, and then I've never completely lost that. So I'm still uneasy about the money machine approach to the practice of law, and ultimately, I left Fine Hatfield really as a result of that, Isidore died in about 75, I think. And Gene took over, and I still like Gene. I'm seeing Gene Fine this afternoon. We're going to see drug court graduation, and then we're going out to eat. So, I still see Gene and think quite well of Gene. But when Gene took over the law firm, there was a little more emphasis on the modern approach to, we're basically a business, let's make money. And I was somewhat uncomfortable with that. And it got to the point where there were really differences. I had trouble accepting the new emphasis on money, and there was one particular fee issue where I'd quoted a client a fee on an estate. This is what it would be, and the others, and it got to be more time than anticipated. Not greatly more, but some more. And then everybody else wanted me to increase the fee, and I said, no, I'm not going to do it. That'd be going back on what I said. But that was just a symptom of the change. I guess I was more comfortable with the earlier Fine Hatfield. I wasn't so comfortable with the new Fine Hatfield. New people were coming into the firm, aggressive people of a different age and different views on things, particularly financial matters, and there'd be talk about if you have a and again, I say this more across the board. It's not really Fine Hatfield, but across the board, there's more pressure, I think. Okay, if you have a minimum billing unit of a quarter of an hour, okay, if you have a 5-minute conversation, you write down a quarter of an hour. Well, no, a 5-minute conversation shouldn't be a quarter of an hour. Mm-hmm. Those sorts of issues or if you spent some time, you weren't quite sure whether you spent point 0.2 or 0.3, okay, write down 0.3. Well, no, wait, maybe it was 0.2. Those sorts of things. And again, I wouldn't make this Fine Hatfield. I'd make it more, I'm speaking more broadly across the board. I think those were the issues in the various law firms. The Joe Hatfield was followed in his father's footsteps. His father was a trial attorney. Joe Hatfield was a trial attorney. He did defense work for insurance companies. He was a very highly ethical man. He sort of lived in his own, he sort of carved out his own section of the firm. He didn't like management decisions. I don't think he ever really got very much involved in management decisions. And he let Isidore do it. He just wanted to practice law. And he was very diligent. If he had a trial, he prepared to the nth degree. He was old school. He would be very well prepared, very diligent. The other lawyer in town that he admired greatly was Bob Hahn. Okay, Bob Hahn was the epitome of that. Joe Hatfield and Bob Hahn were pretty much the same school. Where if you had a trial coming up, you always out-prepared your opposing lawyer. You prepared to the nth degree. I remember talking to an insurance, a Liberty Mutual person who they gave cases to Joe Hatfield to defend, and Joe would have him do this and this and this and this to help him prepare and do a lot of legwork in preparation for the trial. But Joe was very thorough, very methodical, very dignified, and a very good trial attorney, I think, but just ever so thorough. So very admirable in many ways. He eventually became president of the State Bar Association. His father had been active, I think, in the Bar Association. Joe was very active in the Bar Association. Very active, I think, in the local bar association and the state association. And I remember a very dignified man. I remember Larry Daly, who was more of a free spirit personality, who was in the trial department at Fine Hatfield for a while. Came in and he went in and had a conference, and Larry, in the course of the conversation, used the word "damn," and Joe Hatfield just stopped him right there and says, "I never want to hear words like that." this is a lawyer. You know, that's sort of stunning. But he was very dignified, and he didn't want to hear any bad words. Even the word damn was off limits. And but that was Joe. And again, that old school. But you know, must be admired in the old school. Another favorite saying of Joe Hatfield was, on any new matter that came in, he liked to say, have you looked up the statute? So the first thing you should always do on any matter was look up the statute. So many times attorneys would start plunging into something without doing the first thing, which is look up the relevant statute. So they were good mentors. I mean, you hear these things, and so they were really good people to work with in your initial years as a lawyer. Jim Marchand was in the real estate end. He had a lot of real estate work. And when you walk into Jim's office, it's always piled with papers. There were stacks everywhere. And if you had to find a chair to sit down, you had some work cut out for you. But that was Jim. He always seemed to have plenty of work, and there were always these huge stacks of papers. It's like you were entering the Jim Marchand cave when you walked into his office. But he was always very friendly, always very low key, had a sense of humor. I liked Jim a lot. Talked rather slow. You tend to have rather long conversations with Jim, and his wife turned out to be quite a notable person. She's the lady who worked for redevelopment, the Metropolitan.
She was the
Metropolitan
historical
Development
officer for.
Yeah, she was the historical officer for what now is the Department of Metropolitan.
DMV, yes.
Yeah, Metropolitan Development. But she did just an extraordinary amount of work on writing the history of the fine old houses of Evansville. And actually, Jim helped her. So
yes.
She would sort of write it in rough, and then Jim would refine what she had written. And so it was partly Jim who worked with her, but she was the one who got out there. She had the consuming interest, so Joan was an interesting and important person. I notice now they have a little bridge named after her.
Yes, they do.
A little red bridge that I see as I come to work. So anyway, they were all interesting people, and I look back fondly. They were good people to be with in my early years. Okay, I've got notes on other things. I think I've covered quite a bit of the Fine Hatfield stuff. In '82, like I said, difference in philosophies, I would say. I was more of the original Fine Hatfield philosophy, and I did not really want to adapt to the more modern business model Fine Hatfield. And eventually I came to a break, and I would always console myself when things were a little rough at the office or there was some issue by saying, well, if it gets too bad, I can always go out on my own, thinking that, would be a soothing thought. And I think, well, if it gets too bad, I can always go out on my own. Well, lo and behold, finally it did get too bad. and I thought, well, I've always thought this, I guess I'll just go out on my own. And by that time, I'd been there 15 years, and so I'd developed certain relationships, and I think I'd have had trouble going out on my own after 5 years or 10 years. But my thought was, as I left, golly, I finally developed to the point where I'm really worth something, and they're letting me get away. I think I'm strong enough to go out on my own now. And now they finally built me to somebody who's got some pretty good skills and knowledge, and they're letting me get away. But anyway, I did break away and I went out on Lincoln Avenue and just a converted house. It was partly a real estate office, and then part was vacant, and I took the part that was vacant, and it was just one attorney law office. And I thought, well, now I can do things the way I want to do them. And I don't. If I want to cut a fee, I can cut a fee. And I can feel like each client that comes in, I'm being fair to them. And though there certainly were challenges, I had to worry about, did we have enough toilet paper and stuff like that I never had to give attention to before. And what sort of machine to buy and what sort of copier to buy and all that sort of thing. And but I enjoyed it because it was the freedom to finally be able to do the things the way I wanted to. And well, it was interesting because I thought, well, I'll probably maybe have enough work to keep busy half time, at least. But work flowed in. It was surprising, you know, how the first year was a little rough as far as the income coming in, but it started building up pretty quickly, and after a while, I had plenty to keep me busy, and then after about 2 years, more than I could handle, and then I hired Reed Schmidt, fresh out of law school. So I left in '82, hired Reed in '84, and what was really pleasing to me was that with the Bar Association, I realized that if I couldn't go down the hall anymore at Fine Hatfield, but I could call other attorneys, and I found other attorneys to be more than willing to help me. So if there's something where I needed a form or had a question, I could call Jack Schrader or any of a variety of other attorneys, and they would be more than willing to help me. I realized, appreciated then more than ever, how valuable the Bar Association was in the community of lawyers. And
Let me take a break, Jerry.
Okay, so I think sort of the theme that I've had and what I've said is that I've seen the Bar Association, the practice of law in Evansville during my term sort of change from what I'd call the noble practice to the money machine approach, and I think we're all influenced by that, but it has been a change, and of course, good financially. Lawyers are doing better financially than they did when they started. But yet, has something been lost? Our clients doing as well under that. I think something should be said about the old-time secretaries. When I started at Fine Hatfield in 1967, I came into that law office, and you'd have these secretaries who had been there forever, and they were like, one particularly was like a little tyrant. And a young lawyer would come into an office, and this was typical of larger offices. There'd be some secretary who was just a tyrant, and the lawyer would go up to this old tyrant secretary and ask her, would she please type this or that, and almost have to get her permission. It was almost like, so the pecking order was. The old attorney up here, his longtime legal secretary here, and the associate down here somewhere. And so you'd have to sort of, one thing that was difficult in some of these larger firms was you'd almost have to beg to get somebody to type your work. If it was the old-time secretary who'd been there 30 years, who actually did know a lot more than you did as the young attorney, it was a strange situation. And so we had particularly one of those at Fine Hatfield, but she was nice in her way, but she was testy, and you knew she was testy, but they were not all that way. Some of the but they had secretaries who were there forever. They would have secretaries there who had been there 30 years, and they were sort of like iron women of iron because. I came in with copiers. '67 was about when the new copiers were coming in. But you look in files, you can see all these carbon copies of stuff. And if a secretary is typing a long document and she got it just 3/4 of the way down the page and made a mistake, well, they would try to have these whiteouts or something. But if it was very bad, they just have to start typing the whole thing over, and perfectly. And so, they really were held to a high standard. Mm-hmm. And so when they got these typewriters where if you messed up a word, you could just sort of run it back and retype the word. Boy, that was a dramatic change in law offices. And you didn't, and maybe you didn't need the perfect secretary quite as much as you used to, but that was a tremendous development within a law office when you no longer had to start, the secretary no longer had to start typing that page from the top again. And so copiers, I don't know if this has come out, but copiers were a wonderful development in law offices. And those even those terribly old typewriters by our standards, where they could go back for the last 20 words or something and retype, or I mean they were just one step above the old typewriter, but they could go back and undo. I don't even know exactly how they did it, but they had limited memory typewriters, but the development in copiers and typewriters was pretty dramatic in the late 60s, early 70s, and that really changed the law office. You began to be able to put out more work product, and secretaries could get more out, and it was better for secretaries. But when I started, you had all these 30-year secretaries who were really quite good, and it was a different age. And over in probate division, I did a lot of estate planning and probate work. At Fine Hatfield, as far as what type of law I did, basically I filled the holes that existed when I came in there. So as far as me deciding, do I want to be a trial attorney, do I want to be a real estate attorney, well, their openings were in estate planning, estate administration, corporate work, and for a while pension and profit sharing. And so those were the holes that I had to fill. And but part of my responsibility was probate, and I'd go in and file things with Florence Sherbrooke. Have you ever heard of Florence Sherbrooke?
No.
She was another little tyrant, and she had been probate clerk for a long time. You remember her, Jim? And but she was very, very meticulous. So nowadays you go over and they sort of glance over the papers and stamp it, and all's well. Well, in those days, you'd go in at Florence Sherbrooke, there'd be attorneys lined up. There'd be 6 or 7 attorneys lined up to go take a chair in front of Florence Sherbrooke. And then she would read every line. And if there's anything, she delighted in finding something that was wrong. Well, this word isn't right, or there's a problem with this sentence. There'd be other attorneys, like 6 attorneys standing there waiting to get in front of Florence Sherbrooke. And she would be reaming out to whoever the attorney was. And then when you got up there, she might be reaming out you. And it was even worse for me because I was usually taking other people's work product over there. It usually wasn't my stuff. It was Isidore's or somebody's. And Isidore wasn't always quick to adapt to the times. So if they'd changed the way they did something at probate, well, Isidore hadn't been over there in 10 years. And so the word didn't always filter back, and so she would, I'd have something with Isidore or somebody else, and she said, well, we don't do it this way anymore. But anyway, she's like, you felt like you were back in kindergarten, and she was your kindergarten teacher. But she was that way with all lawyers. But she was very meticulous. I mean, I'm sure the work product that came through her was quite good, because she would proofread everything you filed as you sat there. And so she was something, but she was just like a strict kindergarten teacher, but did good work. But boy, it was slow though. I mean, you wasted a lot of time as you stood over there. And then Mary Lee Hahn succeeded her, and Mary Lee was much more personable than Florence was, but she also was pretty meticulous and look at things pretty carefully, and you needed to have it right. She did good work. I like Mary Lee. She was up and down in her moods, but overall, she did a good job. So I mean, I would say Florence Sherbrooke did a good job. Mary Lee Hahn did a good job, but it was Florence Sherbrooke was that old age. I mean, the practice of law in the older age. But she was somebody I remember her. It's funny now. Wasn't quite so funny when you were sitting in front of her and she was pointing out some little error in what you'd prepared and were trying to file. Okay. One other thing on advertising, to show you how dramatically things have changed on advertising. The reason I remember about the year the Supreme Court decision came that lawyer advertising was protected under free speech was shortly before then I had gotten admitted to Rotary, and the custom in Rotary in those days was after you were admitted as a new member, a few weeks later you'd give a vocational talk, and I can remember telling them, well, I don't think I can give a vocational talk because that would be like advertising, and ethically we cannot advertise. and so I basically said I didn't think ethically I could give a vocational talk because of lawyer ethics. And then about a year later we got the Supreme Court decision where you could even go on television and say how great you were. So just that, you can't overemphasize what a dramatic change that was, that Supreme Court decision. Okay, I think better cut it off there. I was president of the Bar Association in '86, '87. I think
we'd like to have you come back and give us another hour or so on that, because
well, hopefully not an hour, but it was a time of transition. That's why I think there are some worthwhile things to say.
I think you can give some real insight there. So.
And that was also the year, remember, that Randy Shepard was named
to the Supreme Court.
Named Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
You're right. So you can talk about that also. That's right.
Yeah,
Thank you, John.
Wes Bowers would be good to talk on that too.
We'll schedule you to come back.
Okay, good enough. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.